communication. When people think of communication, they might think of they're texting somebody, you're on the phone, you're FaceTiming, you're DMing on a social media platform. You might also think of in-person conversations, like one-on-one in a group of friends. Maybe you're in a meeting or you're over Zoom on a business call. But what people ultimately don't think of is the nonverbal aspect of communication. So, nonverbal communication is actually communicating, but without the use of words. Another name for nonverbal communication will be manual language. So, manual language is like the expression of emotions or the intent had behind certain verbal conversations. So, this just adds more background information to verbal conversations. So, when I think of nonverbal communication, I think of maybe when you're reading an article, like the first page or the first paragraph is all background information on what the article is going to be about. Or if you're a reader like I am, you'll read the back of a book and it'll show you like the synopsis or the characters and what they're bringing to the story, what the plot of the story is. That's what I think of as nonverbal communication, intent of verbal communication. It's important to utilize nonverbal communication correctly in order to have the best experience in a counseling setting. So the first one and the most important one, in my opinion, would be facial expressions. The face is going to be the first thing people notice when they look at you. So examples of facial expressions would be like a frown can mean sadness, or a smile can mean you're happy or you're having a joyful moment. Some people like to crease their eyebrows right there. It'll maybe show frustration or confusion. So an example of how this could be portrayed maybe in a counseling setting is that a client is maybe telling a story or they're having a conversation with the counselor, and the counselor is heavily affected by this story and they're upset. Maybe they're frowning, they're maybe creasing their eyebrows, their tears are welling up. This can be maybe a negative use of the nonverbal communication in the counseling setting. It's important to utilize facial expressions effectively and to know when to lock them up and when not to use them. So showing that you're sad or you're upset during a story that a client is telling may make them feel uncomfortable, and it may make them feel like maybe you're not being professional. Another great example of nonverbal communication would be gestures. So a great gesture would be like the picture of the thumbs up, which means great, okay, good, or the opposite, thumbs down, bad, not good, not okay. So in a counseling setting, for example, maybe a client is rambling on and the counselor is just leaning their head against their hand like I am right now. That could show the client that maybe the counselor's a little bored with the conversation, or maybe they're tired, and this may make the client feel like they're not being heard or they're not being actively listened to. So it's also really important for all nonverbal communications that they are kept in check and they're not actively pushed out and shown in order to make the client feel like they're having the most comfortable conversation with you. Another great one is paralinguistics. This one I think is really interesting because it's not actively using words, it's how you're using the words. So it's the tone of voice, or maybe the attitude held behind your words, or how loud you're speaking. So an example of paralinguistics maybe not used in a counseling setting, maybe with a parent. So say you got in an argument with your mom and she's like, get over here, and she says it really loud and her attitude is kind of headstrong. That might make you feel a little more scared to actually go over to your parent. But say they're like, can you come here? And they say it really nicely, a softer tone of voice. That might make you feel more inclined to actually go over there. Same can be said in a counseling setting. The way you talk to your client is so important. If you have maybe an attitude, even if you don't realize it, it can make your client feel like maybe you're not really wanting to help them. And I think it's really important to make your client the most comfortable. So having like a steady tone of voice, making sure you're not talking too loudly, even too quietly, because you need your client to be able to hear you. It's very important. Another really main one would be body language. So if you notice in the picture that I actually used, the first guy's kind of like slouching over, looking over his papers, and the second person is actually sitting upright, like kind of looking at you with intent. I feel like it's important for the client to feel like they're being listened to and heard, and a great way to do that is to maybe be sitting up straight and looking at them directly and not hunched over looking at maybe a book you're writing in, a book of information about them. And it's also important to maybe sit properly. It might make you look more professional, it might make them feel like you are more professional. And then we have proxemics. So this one is more about like personal space. So personal space can be used to make the client feel maybe more secure. It might make them feel more sense of trust. It might make them feel more comfortable. Using proxemics correctly can really show the limits you have with your client, and it can also show them a sense of privacy that maybe they might not feel because they might be forced to be there with you. It just would overall make them feel more comfortable with you as a counselor. I think eye gaze is one of the most important ones because I think having eye contact with your client will make them feel like you are really actively listening to what they're trying to say to you. It might make you seem like you care about what they say. So there are many different ways of eye gaze. There's like the eye contact, like I mentioned, there's blinking, there's rolling of the eyes. So it just basically is nonverbal communication done all with your eyes. So I think eye gaze just will really show your client that you have their full attention no matter what. Haptics is touch, so it's communicating using touch. So when you're shaking your client's hand, it's like a greeting. I think shaking hands and maybe a pat on the back is the farthest you should be going with a client, especially when you are first meeting them. Going too far and giving them a hug might make them feel uncomfortable. Also, you don't know their story and you don't know how comfortable they are with physical touch. So stuff like a handshake and a pat on the back is a great intro greeting to the haptics part of nonverbal communication in a counseling setting. Appearance is also a really big one. So when you show up to, say, a meeting and you are working as a CEO in a high position and you show up wearing like pajama pants and a hoodie, it might not make you feel like professional. It might not make your team value you as a CEO or your input on what they have to say. The same can be said in a counseling setting. If you show up to the session with your client and you're dressed in pajamas, it's not a very good look on the counselor, and it might make the client seem like there are better counselors to be going to. Because ultimately, when you think of a counselor, the first thing you'll think of is like, the first thing I think of at least is like pants, nice slacks, maybe like a dress shirt, not necessarily like a full tuxedo, suit and tie, or like a ball gown, but like dressing appropriately. Like I think of something you'd wear to a job interview is something I would wear as a counselor in a counseling setting. So bringing this all together and connecting it all into one is showing the power dynamic in a client and a counseling setting. So ultimately, showing all of these nonverbal communications correctly can really utmost show the power you have in the setting and to utilize it correctly and to not overpower your client. It also shows them respect, and it will make them feel more comfortable with you as a counselor.